At 6:30 a.m. on the 7th of July 1919, a convoy of 81 military vehicles rolled out of the zero milestone marker on the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. The line included trucks, ambulances, a mobile kitchen, a searchlight truck, and a water tanker. The mission was officially called the Transcontinental Motor Convoy, and its goal was to drive from the capital to San Francisco following the Lincoln Highway. Everything seemed organized. The convoy commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. McClure, had prepared maps and schedules. The route was marked in advance. The vehicles had been inspected. Only a few days later, something was off. By the third day, July 9th, the convoy had crossed into Ohio. The roads were narrow, unpaved, and rutted. At 10:15 a.m. near the town of Zanesville, a heavy rainstorm had turned a section of the Lincoln Highway into a thick clay mud. The lead truck, a 4-ton Liberty, began to sink. The driver pressed the accelerator. The wheels spun. The truck lurched sideways and stopped. The convoy halted. Soldiers jumped out and attempted to dig the wheels free with shovels. They laid wooden planks under the tires. The truck moved 3 feet and sank again. By 11:30 a.m., 5 more vehicles were stuck in the same stretch. The convoy was delayed for 4 hours. A local farmer brought a team of horses to help pull the trucks out. The convoy did not reach its planned campsite until after dark. What happened was not unusual. The Lincoln Highway, the first improved transcontinental road in the United States, was announced in 1913 by a group of automobile industry leaders. Its backers included Carl G. Fisher, the founder of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and Henry B. Joy, president of the Packard Motor Car Company. The highway was conceived as a concrete ribbon connecting New York City to San Francisco, a distance of roughly 3,300 miles. But in 1919, less than 200 miles of the route were paved. Most of it was gravel, dirt, or simply 2-tire tracks across open prairie. The Army convoy's problems were not failures. They were the norm. The Lincoln Highway story begins earlier in the summer of 1912. Carl Fisher was frustrated with the poor state of American roads. At that time, there was no federal road system. States built their own routes, often with little coordination. Traveling across the country by automobile was a dangerous and uncertain adventure. Fisher imagined a dedicated coast-to-coast highway, named after Abraham Lincoln, that would unify the nation and prove the value of good roads. He invited other auto executives to a dinner at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City on September 13, 1913. There, the Lincoln Highway Association was formally created. The route was not yet built, it was a concept. But within months, the association began marking a path across the country, using existing roads, town streets, and farmers' lanes wherever possible. The highway was dedicated on October 31, 1913, with ceremonies in towns along the route. But dedicated did not mean finished. For years, the Lincoln Highway was more of an idea than a drivable road. Motorists who attempted the crossing carried shovels, rope, chains, extra tires, and enough food for a week. Gas stations were rare. Hotels were basic. Breakdowns were expected. The first person to officially drive the entire route from New York to San Francisco on the Lincoln Highway was a man named Frank Kulick, a test driver for the Ford Motor Company who made the trip in 1905. His journey took 30 days. He reported that the worst sections were in Nevada and Utah, where the road disappeared completely into desert sand. The Army convoy of 1919 was not a pleasure trip. It was a military exercise designed to test the Army's ability to move vehicles across the country in case of a national emergency. World War I had just ended, and military planners worried about the vulnerability of railroads. Trucks needed roads. The convoy included officers from the Army Motor Transport Corps, as well as a young lieutenant colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower, who served as an observer. Eisenhower kept a diary of the trip. He noted the constant breakdowns, the poor roads, and the lack of reliable bridges. On July 14th, near the border between Indiana and Illinois, a truck fell through a wooden bridge over a creek. The bridge had been rated for 5 tons. The truck weighed 3 tons empty, but the wood was rotted. The convoy spent 2 hours lifting the truck out with jacks and cables. Eisenhower later wrote that the experience convinced him of the need for a national highway system. But the Lincoln Highway was not just a military concern. It was also a commercial and social experiment. The association hoped that a good road would bring tourism, trade, and progress to small towns that were isolated by mud and distance. It published guidebooks, placed signs, and encouraged local communities to improve their sections. By the 1920s, parts of the highway were paved. Gas stations and diners appeared. The Lincoln Highway became a symbol of mobility and modernity. In 1925, when the federal government introduced the U.S. highway numbering system, the Lincoln Highway was largely absorbed into U.S. Route 30 from Pennsylvania to Wyoming, and later into U.S. Route 50 in parts of California. As the decades passed, the original Lincoln Highway faded from public memory. The interstate highway system, built starting in the 1950s, bypassed many of the old towns and roads. The Lincoln Highway Association dissolved in 1928. The signs came down. The route was forgotten except by historians and enthusiasts. But the story of the Lincoln Highway is not just about a road. It is about the people who built it, drove it, and were changed by it. It is about the failure of early road infrastructure, the persistence of drivers, and the slow, painful process of connecting a continent. Investigators of the past, in a sense, have examined the Lincoln Highway and found both achievements and shortcomings. The highway was never fully completed as originally planned. The concrete ribbon from sea to sea never materialized. Money ran out, political support waned, and the Great Depression shifted priorities. The Lincoln Highway Association raised millions of dollars through private donations and local subscriptions, but it was never enough. Some sections were paved by the association itself, using concrete donated by members. Other sections remained dirt until the 193s rose when state road departments took over. How could this have happened? A highway that was meant to be the backbone of a nation built by the automobile industry itself fell short of its promise. The reasons are many. The highway was too ambitious for its era. The technology for building long-distance roads was still in its infancy. Concrete paving was expensive and required skilled labor. The rural counties that the highway crossed did not have the tax base to maintain it, and the federal government did not start funding interstate highways until the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1916, which provided matching funds to states. But even then, the money was limited and came with strings attached. The Lincoln Highway Association lobbied hard, but the political will to build a national road system was not yet present. The system that failed was not a machine but a method. The Lincoln Highway was a private project trying to solve a public problem. The association's leaders were idealists and businessmen, but they were not engineers or government officials. They believed that good roads would pay for themselves through increased commerce. They underestimated the scale of the task. By the time the association dissolved in 1928, only about 40% of the route was paved. The rest was gravel, dirt, or mud, yet the Lincoln Highway did not disappear entirely. It left a legacy. The route itself became the foundation for many later highways. Towns that the highway passed through grew and prospered, at least for a while. The highway also proved that a transcontinental road was possible. It inspired other named highways, such as the Dixie Highway, the Yellowstone Trail, and later the U.S. highway system. Most importantly, the experience of driving the Lincoln Highway gave men like Dwight Eisenhower a first-hand understanding of the need for a national road network. Decades later, as president, Eisenhower would sign the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which created the interstate highway system. The interstates, with their 4 lanes, limited access, and high speed, were the direct descendants of the rough, rutted, and uncertain road that had delayed the convoy in Ohio. The forgotten story of the Lincoln Highway is not a tragedy. It is a story of ambition, improvisation, and gradual progress. The highway itself is still there in fragments. Many sections of the original route still exist as local roads, sometimes paved, sometimes gravel. You can still drive parts of it from New York to San Francisco if you know where to look. There are markers, monuments, and one remaining original concrete milepost still standing in Pennsylvania. The Lincoln Highway Association was revived in the 1990s and now works to preserve the road's history. The questions that remain are not about what went wrong, but about what was lost. The Lincoln Highway was a human-scale road. It passed through the front door of small towns. It forced drivers to slow down, to stop, to talk to locals, to see the country. Interstates that replaced it are faster and safer, but they are also isolated. You can drive from coast to coast now without seeing a single main street. The Lincoln Highway was a connection between places. The interstates are a connection between cities. The difference is subtle but important. In July 1919, when the Army convoy finally reached San Francisco on September 6th, after 62 days on the road, the soldiers were exhausted. They had averaged less than 50 miles per day. They had repaired hundreds of breakdowns. They had crossed rivers on temporary bridges and pulled each other out of mud countless times. Eisenhower, in his diary, called the trip an adventure. But he also noted with dry understatement that the roads were no good. That observation, born on the Lincoln Highway, would change the face of America. The forgotten story of the Lincoln Highway is not just about a road. It is about how a nation learned to move. On September 7, 1919, the day after the Army convoy reached San Francisco, the trucks were lined up for inspection at the Presidio. Eisenhower stood in the California sun and counted the vehicles that had made it. 24 of the original 73 trucks had dropped out along the way. The rest were battered, with cracked frames, broken springs, and burned-out clutches. The convoy had lost a total of 230 days of repair time during the journey. One truck had been abandoned in the Utah desert when its engine seized and no replacement parts were available. The trip, which Eisenhower would later describe as a formative experience, covered 3,250 miles and cost the Army an estimated $160,000 in 1919 dollars, or roughly $2 million today. The Lincoln Highway had been tested and found wanting. What happened after the convoy? The reports that followed were detailed and grim. The Army Motor Transport Corps issued a 2-volume study in 1920 that cataloged every bridge failure, every mud hole, every detour. The report concluded that the Lincoln Highway as a through route was not suitable for military traffic. It recommended that the federal government take over road construction and fund a system of transcontinental highways built to uniform standards. The report was filed. Congress did not act. Meanwhile, the Lincoln Highway Association continued its work. In 1920, the association began a program of seedling miles, sections of concrete pavement that were built as demonstrations. The first seedling mile was poured in Douglas County, Illinois on a hot August day in 1920. A crowd of 500 people watched as the concrete was mixed on site, spread by hand, and finished with wooden floats. The mile cost $30,000. The association hoped that local communities would see the benefits of concrete and pave their own sections. Some did, many did not. By 1925, the association had raised and spent over $4 million on road improvements. But the task was larger than any private organization could handle. The United States in the 1920s had over 3 million miles of roads. Only 150,000 miles were paved. The rest were dirt, gravel, or nothing at all. The Lincoln Highway, for all its fame, was still a dirt road across most of Nevada and Utah. In the spring, the mud was so deep that drivers reported cars sinking to their axles. In the summer, the dust was so thick that travelers tied wet handkerchiefs over their mouths. In the winter, the snow closed the road entirely for weeks at a time. Then came the end of an era. On December 1, 1927, the Lincoln Highway Association held its final board meeting in Detroit. The directors voted to dissolve the organization. The Great Depression was still 2 years away, but the association's finances were already strained. Membership had declined. The automobile industry, which had funded the highway originally, was now more interested in selling cars than in building roads. The federal government had begun to take over highway planning through the Bureau of Public Roads. The association's mission was complete, or at least obsolete. The remaining funds, about $70,000, were donated to state highway departments for maintenance. The signs came down. The name Lincoln Highway disappeared from official maps, replaced by U.S. Route 30 and other numbers. But the road itself did not disappear. It simply became less visible. In the 1930s, state highway departments began paving the remaining dirt sections as part of New Deal work programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration sent crews to grade and gravel the Lincoln Highway in Wyoming and Nevada. By 1940, the entire route was paved, at least in some form. But the pavement was narrow, often only 18 feet wide, and the curves were sharp. The road was built for the cars of the 1910s, not the trucks and buses of the 1940s. World War II brought new demands. The military needed to move troops and equipment across the country quickly. The old Lincoln Highway became a military supply route. In 1942, the Army conducted a second transcontinental convoy, this time using modern trucks and following the same route. The trip took 14 days, down from 62 days in 1909. The roads had improved, but the military planners noted that even with improvements, the route was still too slow and too hazardous. The war experience reinforced the need for a dedicated highway system. After the war, the push for interstate highways gained momentum. In 1954, President Eisenhower appointed a committee to study the problem. The committee recommended a $40 billion 10-year program to build 40,000 miles of divided highways. On June 29, 1956, Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. The interstate system was born. The routes that were chosen often paralleled the old Lincoln Highway. Interstate 80, for example, follows the Lincoln Highway across much of Nebraska, Wyoming, and Utah. Interstate 30 in Illinois and Iowa runs close to the original route, but the interstates were not the Lincoln Highway. They were wider, faster, and safer. They also bypassed the towns that the Lincoln Highway had built. When 80 opened through central Nebraska in the early 1960s, the small towns along the old Lincoln Highway like Gothenburg, Kazad, and Lexington saw their main street traffic drop by 80%. Motels closed, gas stations shut down, restaurants boarded up. The economic life of these communities shifted away from the old road. Some towns survived by building their own exits and service roads. Others simply withered. What about the people who had driven the Lincoln Highway? By the 1950s, the generation that had pioneered cross-country driving was dying. The old guides published by the association were out of print. The road itself had become a local road, used by farmers and truckers who knew the shortcuts but not the history. The Lincoln Highway was forgotten except by a few enthusiasts. One of those enthusiasts was a man named Glenn Stewart, a retired high school teacher from Ogden, Utah. In 1992, Stewart was driving through western Wyoming when he noticed a faded concrete marker with a red, white, and blue shield. He stopped and got out. The marker said Lincoln Highway at the top. Below it was a small metal plaque that read, "This is the Lincoln Highway, constructed 1913 Wyatt." Stewart had never heard of the Lincoln Highway. He started researching. He found old maps, documents, and photographs. He learned about the 1919 convoy and Eisenhower's connection. He realized that much of the road was still there, hidden under later pavement or abandoned as gravel lanes. Stewart contacted the few other people who knew about the road. In 1993, they formed the new Lincoln Highway Association. The new association had modest goals: to preserve the remaining markers and mileposts, to document the route, and to educate the public. They found that only about 200 of the original mileposts were still standing. Most had been removed during road widening or taken by souvenir hunters. One original concrete milepost, number 50 in Pennsylvania, was relocated to a rest area. Another, number 112 in Iowa, was discovered in a farmer's field half buried. The new association worked with state highway departments to install new markers along the surviving sections. By 2010, the association had mapped the entire original route. They found that about 60% of the Lincoln Highway still exists as drivable public roads. The other 40% has been paved over by interstates, converted into private drives, or simply abandoned and reclaimed by vegetation. The longest continuous stretch of original road is in Nevada, where a 70-mile section of the old highway runs parallel to 80. The pavement is cracked, the shoulders are soft, and the white center line is barely visible, but you can still drive it. The drive takes about 2 hours at 45 miles per hour past sagebrush and distant mountains with no gas stations and no cell service. In 2013, the Lincoln Highway Association celebrated the centennial of the road. They organized a cross-country caravan that followed the original route from New York to San Francisco. The caravan included 50 cars, ranging from a 1913 Model T Ford to modern sedans. The drive took 28 days. The participants reported that the road in Nebraska was smooth, the road in Nevada was still rough, and the road in Pennsylvania was scenic and narrow. They also reported that many locals, when asked about the Lincoln Highway, had no idea what they were talking about. The questions that remain are not about the road itself. They are about what the road represents. The Lincoln Highway was a private effort to solve a public problem. It was a vision of a connected nation, conceived by businessmen, executed by volunteers, and sustained by faith. It failed in its original ambition but succeeded in proving that a transcontinental road was possible. The interstates that replaced it are the direct descendants of that vision, but they are also a departure from it. The Lincoln Highway was a road that belonged to the towns it passed through. The interstates are roads that pass through nothing. How could this have happened? The answer is simple. The Lincoln Highway was a product of its time, and its time passed. The road was built for an America of small towns, local economies, and slow travel. The interstates were built for an America of mass production, interstate commerce, and fast travel. The old road could not compete, but the old road did not disappear entirely. It lingers in the margins, in the faded signs, in the concrete mileposts, in the memories of the few who still remember it. One of those memories belongs to Robert C. King, a retired truck driver from Winnemucca, Nevada. King drove the Lincoln Highway in the 1950s before 80 was built. He remembered the steep grades, the narrow bridges, the constant shifting of gears. He remembered stopping at a diner in Battle Mountain that served pie and coffee for 35 cents. He remembered the long, straight stretches where you could see the road disappear over the horizon. He remembered the loneliness of the desert at night. King died in 2006. His son donated his old road maps to the association. The maps are covered in notes. Good pavement here. Watch for washouts after rain. Bridge out at mile 47. They are artifacts of a road that no longer exists as a highway but survives as a story. The story of the Lincoln Highway is not just about the road. It is about the people who built it, drove it, and forgot it. It is about the failure of ambition and the success of persistence. It is about a nation that learned to move slowly and painfully across a continent that was always larger and more difficult than anyone had imagined. And it is about the road itself, still there, waiting to be remembered. On the morning of November 17, 1998, a small group of volunteers gathered at a dusty pull-off along a two-lane road in the middle of Nevada. The road was State Route 722, a lonely ribbon of asphalt that runs parallel to Interstate 80 between the towns of Austin and Fallon. The volunteers carried shovels, bags of concrete mix, and a single metal form. Their goal was to pour a replica of an original Lincoln Highway milepost. The original marker at that spot, number 45, had been removed in the 1960s during a highway widening project. The Nevada Department of Transportation had no record of where it ended up. The local county road crew thought it might have been broken up for fill. So the association, with permission from the state, decided to cast a new one. They worked for 3 hours, mixing concrete by hand, pouring it into the form, and letting it set. By noon, the marker was in place. It was not an exact replica. The original was a simple concrete slab with carved letters, while this one used a metal plaque, but it served the same purpose, to remind anyone passing that this was once the Lincoln Highway. The man who drove the project was David G. L. Thomas, a retired civil engineer from Reno. Thomas had been a member of the new Lincoln Highway Association since 1994. He had spent years photographing every surviving section of the road in Nevada. He knew that the terrain between Austin and Fallon was among the most dangerous on the original route. The road climbed over the Shoshone Range, with grades as steep as 8%, hairpin turns, and no guardrails. In 1915, a driver named Beatrice Carroll had stalled her Model T on the grade near the summit and had to walk 5 miles for help. In 1921, a truck carrying dynamite overturned on the same curve, killing the driver instantly. Thomas had archived newspaper clippings, accident reports, and personal diaries. He knew that the road had not been widened or straightened since the 193's rows. It was a museum piece preserved by neglect. What happened to the Lincoln Highway after the interstates took over? The answer is complicated. In some places, the highway was simply abandoned. In others, it was downgraded to a county road. In still others, it was absorbed into state highway systems under different numbers. The road itself never disappeared, but its identity did. By the 1970s, the Lincoln Highway had become a ghost, visible on old maps, remembered by a few old-timers, but officially non-existent. The federal government stopped using the name in 1928 when the numbering system was implemented. The association disbanded in 193's row. The concrete markers were left to weather and crack. The guidebooks were out of print. The road became what historians call a lost landscape. But lost does not mean gone. In the 198's, a handful of people began to rediscover the Lincoln Highway. They were not academics or preservationists at first. They were travelers, truck drivers, and farmers who had grown up hearing stories about the road. One of them was a woman named Martha L. Erickson, a schoolteacher from Pittsburgh. In 1982, Erickson was driving back from a family reunion in Ohio when she took a detour off 80 to avoid a traffic jam. The detour took her onto an old two-lane road that followed a creek bed. She saw a faded sign that said Lincoln Highway. She pulled over and looked more closely. The sign was rusted, barely legible, but it sparked something. Erickson began researching. She found that the road passed within a mile of her childhood home in New Jersey. She started writing letters to local historical societies. She eventually located over 200 original markers, most of them in poor condition. She published a pamphlet in 1985 called The Lost Highway that became the basis for the later preservation movement. Erickson's work, combined with Glenn Stewart's discovery in Wyoming, led to the formation of the new Lincoln Highway Association in 1993. The association's first project was to survey the entire route from New York to San Francisco. They used old maps, aerial photographs, and interviews with elderly residents. They found that the route had been altered in many places. In Illinois, the original road had been bypassed by a 4-lane highway in 1956, but the old pavement was still there under a layer of gravel. In Iowa, the highway had been renumbered County Road 30, but the original bridges were still standing. In Utah, the road had been absorbed into U.S. Route 40, then abandoned when 80 opened. The association created a detailed map published in 1995 that showed the exact path of the Lincoln Highway. It was the first complete route guide in over 60 years. The restoration of markers followed. The original mileposts were numbered from 1 in New York to 143 in San Francisco. Each marker was spaced 1 mile apart. The association decided to replace missing markers with replicas. They raised money through donations and grants. They worked with state historic preservation offices. By 2005, they had installed over 80 new markers. Some were placed at historic sites like the Lincoln Highway Bridge in Iowa. Others were placed at rest stops and visitor centers. But many went back to the original locations in the middle of fields at crossroads on the shoulders of old roads. The association also erected interpretive signs that told the story of the highway, but not everyone welcomed the markers. In some communities, the Lincoln Highway was a reminder of a time when the town was thriving before the interstate killed it. In others, the road was a source of frustration, narrow, winding, and unsafe. Local governments occasionally removed the new markers because they interfered with snowplows or mowing. In one case in Pennsylvania, a farmer shot at a marker because he believed it was a survey marker for a new development. The association learned to negotiate carefully, to explain that the markers were not official road signs, just historical markers. They also learned that the road itself had become a site of conflict between preservation and development. In 2007, a construction company in Wyoming proposed to widen a section of Old Lincoln Highway to improve access to a coal mine. The section was a 2-mile stretch of original road, with original curbstones and a stone culvert. The association objected. They argued that the road was eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. The company argued that the road was a safety hazard. The battle went to the State Historic Preservation Office. After a year of hearings, a compromise was reached. The company would widen the road but preserve the curbstones and culvert in place, and the association would fund a small interpretive pull-off. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but it set a precedent. From then on, any project affecting the Lincoln Highway had to go through a review process. The road was no longer invisible. By 2013, the centennial year, the association had achieved much of its original mission. The route was documented, the markers were restored, the story was being told. But the deeper question remained, why does the Lincoln Highway still matter? The answer lies not in the road itself, but in what it represents. The Lincoln Highway was the first attempt to connect the continent by road. It was a private enterprise that succeeded in creating a public good. It was built with the belief that a car could take you anywhere, that the freedom of the road was worth fighting for. But the road also taught a harsh lesson. That ambition without planning leads to failure, that resources are limited, that not everyone will share in the prosperity. The people who drove the Lincoln Highway in its early years faced dangers that modern drivers cannot imagine. Flat tires, broken axles, mud, snow, and heat. No gas stations for miles, no repair shops, no hotels that accepted strangers. The early tourists carried spare parts, food, water, and guns. They slept in the car or under a tarpaulin. They helped each other push cars out of ditches. They formed a community of travelers. This community was not sentimental, it was practical, but it left a legacy of self-reliance and cooperation. One of the last surviving veterans of the 1919 convoy, a man named Harold A. Benson, died in 1998 at the age of 1. In an interview from 1994, Benson was asked what he remembered most about the crossing. He said it was not the mud, not the breakdowns, not the mosquitoes, it was the silence. He said that when the convoy stopped at night in the middle of the plains, there was no sound of engines, no light from towns, just stars and wind. The road, he said, was a line through a silent world. Today, the Lincoln Highway is no longer silent. The interstates hum with traffic. But if you leave the big road and turn onto one of the old segments, you can find that silence again. It is there in the asphalt that has been patched and patched again. It is there in the concrete mileposts that lean at odd angles. It is there in the forgotten towns where the main street is empty and the gas station is boarded up. And it is there in the stories that people still tell. In 2015, a couple from Illinois decided to drive the entire Lincoln Highway from New York to San Francisco on a vintage motorcycle. They spent 3 weeks on the road. They stopped at every marker they could find. In New Jersey, they met a woman whose grandfather had helped build the road. In Nebraska, they talked to a farmer who remembered when the highway was dirt. In Nevada, they camped under the stars near the summit of the Shoshone Range. They said the drive was not about speed. It was about time. The time it takes to cover 3,000 miles at 40 miles per hour, the time it takes to stop and look, the time it takes to remember. The Lincoln Highway is not forgotten. It is waiting for someone to turn off the interstate, to take the old exit, to follow the faded signs. It is waiting for someone to ask what the road means. And when that question is asked, the road answers with the only language it knows, the language of concrete and steel, of curves and grades, of miles and minutes, the language of a century of travel. The road will never be what it was. It will never carry the weight of a nation's hopes. But it will remain as long as the markers stand, as long as the pavement holds, as long as someone remembers to tell the story. And that story will continue because it is not just about the Lincoln Highway. It is about all roads, all journeys, all the moments between departure and arrival. The final milepost, number 143, stood at the edge of Lincoln Park in San Francisco, near the Golden Gate. The original marker was removed in the 1950s for a sewer project. In 1996, the association installed a new marker at the same location. The marker is a simple concrete post with a bronze plaque. It reads, Lincoln Highway, Terminus, New York to San Francisco. 1903. The plaque does not mention the tens of thousands who drove the road, the hundreds who died on it, the towns that rose and fell along it. It does not mention the convoy, the president, the dream. It just says what it is, and that is enough. The story of the Lincoln Highway is the story of every road that has ever been built and then abandoned. It is the story of progress that leaves behind the old and the old that refuses to disappear. It is a story that is still being written, one milepost at a time. At 11:14 a.m. on the 20th of August, 1922, a 1921 Chevrolet touring car approached a railroad crossing on the Lincoln Highway near the village of New Carlisle, Ohio. Inside were 5 members of the Harmon family, Father William, Mother Clara, and their 3 children aged 8, 6, and 4. They were driving from their home in South Bend, Indiana, to visit relatives in Pennsylvania. The crossing was unguarded, with no gates or warning lights. The only sign was a small wooden post that read Railroad Crossing, but it was faded and nearly hidden by weeds. The train was a westbound freight operated by the Big Four Railroad. It consisted of 36 cars pulled by 2 steam locomotives. The engineer later stated he saw the car approaching the crossing at about 15 miles per hour. He sounded the whistle at the standard distance, roughly a quarter mile from the crossing. He said the car did not slow down. The fireman reported that the car appeared to be driving directly into the path of the train, as if the driver had not seen it. The train was traveling at about 40 miles per hour. At that speed, a full emergency stop could not prevent a collision. The crossing was located at a slight curve in the highway just before a hill. The tracks crossed the road at an angle. The driver, William Harmon, would have had a limited view of the approaching train because of a stand of trees along the railroad right-of-way. Those trees were later measured as being between 10 and 15 feet tall. The Illinois Central Railroad had a policy of clearing vegetation within 100 feet of crossings, but the Big Four Railroad did not follow that standard. The trees were not trimmed. When the train struck the Chevrolet, the car was thrown sideways and dragged along the tracks for approximately 150 feet. The impact killed William Harmon instantly. Clara Harmon died within minutes from massive internal injuries. The three children were thrown from the vehicle. The eldest, a boy named Edward, survived for 20 minutes but died before a doctor could arrive from New Carlisle. The other two children, a girl and a boy, died at the scene. The train came to a stop about a quarter-mile past the crossing. The crew immediately ran back to the wreckage, but there was nothing they could do. The coroner arrived at 12:45 p.m. The bodies were taken to a funeral home in New Carlisle. An inquest was held 2 days later. The verdict was accidental death with no fault assigned to the railroad. The jury noted that the crossing was dangerous and recommended that the railroad install gates and signal lights. The railroad did not comply for another 3 years. When the gates were finally installed, they were hand-operated and only used when a train was approaching. The trees were not cut down until 1925, after a second fatal accident at the same crossing claimed 2 more lives. What happened to the Harmon family was not an isolated event. Between 1915 and 1930, the Lincoln Highway recorded hundreds of fatalities at railroad crossings. The highway was largely rural and most crossings were unprotected. State governments had no authority over railroad crossings. The railroads owned the tracks and the land. They were not required to maintain warning devices. The highway itself was not designed for high speeds. The average speed on dirt roads was 25 miles per hour, but on the improved gravel and concrete sections, cars could reach 40 or 50 miles per hour. That combination of increasing speed and inadequate warnings was deadly. The Lincoln Highway Association had identified the crossing problem as early as 1906. In their annual report, they noted that railroad crossings were the single greatest hazard on the route. They called for standardized warning signs and federal oversight, but the railroads lobbied against any regulations. The result was a fragmented system. Some states passed laws requiring crossings to be marked with a standard crossbuck sign, others did not. The crossing where the Harmons died had a crossbuck, but it was small and discolored. The train whistle was the only warning. In the heat of August, with windows rolled up and a family distracted by children, that warning might have been missed. Investigators from the Ohio Public Utilities Commission looked into the accident. They interviewed the train crew, the crossing flagmen who had no flag, and residents of New Carlisle. They measured the sight distance from the crossing. They found that a car approaching from the west, as the Harmons did, had a clear view of the tracks for only 150 feet before the trees blocked it. At 15 miles per hour, that gave the driver less than 7 seconds to react. The train, traveling at 40 miles per hour, covered 150 feet in about 2.5 seconds. By the time the driver could have seen the train, it was already too close. The question that remained unanswered was why William Harmon did not stop. He had driven on dirt roads for years. He had crossed hundreds of railroad tracks. But the trees, the heat, the curve, the faded sign, the lack of gates, and the speed of the train all conspired. It was a failure of design, not of individual judgment. The railroad was not held accountable because the legal system placed the burden entirely on the driver. The driver was assumed to have the duty to look and listen. If he did not, it was his fault. That logic ignored the reality of the road. The road itself was a trap. The Harmon tragedy is one of thousands that have been forgotten along the Lincoln Highway. No marker commemorates the spot. The crossing no longer exists. The railroad abandoned the line in 1958 and the tracks were removed. The highway itself was realigned in the 193's rows and the original crossing is now a field. But the story of the Harmon family is not just about a single mistake. It is about a system that prioritized speed and profit over safety. The Lincoln Highway was built by private investors who wanted to sell cars and tires and gasoline. Safety was an afterthought. The association published guidebooks that warned drivers about dangerous roads, but the warnings were often too vague to be useful. In the aftermath of accidents like this one, the public began to demand better roads. The Good Roads movement gained momentum. Engineers studied road surfaces, sight lines, signage, and intersection design. The federal government started to provide funding for highway construction through the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 and later the Federal Highway Act of 1922. But those funds were tied to standards that included crossing protection. By the late 1920s, many crossings along the Lincoln Highway had been upgraded with gates and lights. The number of crossing fatalities dropped, but they never disappeared. The human cost of the Lincoln Highway was not limited to crossing accidents. There were breakneck curves, washouts, frozen roads, and mechanical failures. Drivers died of exposure after their cars broke down in remote areas. Women traveling alone were assaulted. Children wandered into traffic. The road was a place of both freedom and danger, and the freedom came with a price. The early advocates of the Lincoln Highway often described it as a symbol of American progress, but progress has a shadow. Every milepost along that road marks a story of someone who did not finish the journey. The Harmon family's journey ended at a field in Ohio. Their bodies were sent back to South Bend for burial. The community raised money for the funerals. William Harmon had been a factory foreman. Clara Harmon had been a homemaker. They were not famous. They were not wealthy. They were just people trying to visit family on a road that was supposed to connect them. The road failed them because it was not yet ready for the traffic it carried. Today, the Lincoln Highway is a historical route. It is remembered for its idealism, its ambition, its role in building a national identity, but it should also be remembered for its victims. The road killed hundreds of people who trusted it. The same people who built the road also built the system that eventually made it safer, but that system came too late for the Harmons and many others. The road's legacy is not just the triumph of cross-country travel. It is also the slow, painful process of learning how to make travel safe. The Ohio accident of 1922 is not in any history book about the Lincoln Highway. It is not even in the local newspaper archives of New Carlisle except as a short notice. It was forgotten because it was ordinary. That ordinariness is what makes it important. The Lincoln Highway was not a story of celebrities and extraordinary events. It was a story of ordinary people driving ordinary cars on an extraordinary road. Their deaths were quiet and ignored, but they leave behind a question that still matters: who is responsible for the safety of a road? Answer from the 1-9-2-0s was clear: no one was responsible. The state governments lacked authority. The railroads denied responsibility. The Highway Association was a private group with no enforcement power. The driver was left alone. That answer changed only after enough families like the Harmons died. In 1924, the American Automobile Association began a campaign for uniform traffic laws. In 1926, the Lincoln Highway Association published its own safety guide. In 1935, the federal government established the Bureau of Public Roads, but the Harmons were long buried. The Lincoln Highway is now a memory, but memory has edges. The edges are the accidents, the mistakes, the failures that shape the road. To remember the road is to remember those failures. The Harmon family crossing in Ohio is one of those edges. It tells us that the road was never just a line on a map. It was a place where people lived and died in a time before seatbelts, before airbags, before emergency medical services, before any of the safety systems that modern drivers take for granted. The story of the Lincoln Highway is not complete without the story of its dangers. The dangers were not just physical, they were also economic and social. The road bypassed towns, created winners and losers, and changed the landscape. But the physical dangers were the most immediate. Every driver knew that the next curve could be their last. The guidebooks warned of specific hazards: a sharp curve in Pennsylvania known as Dead Man's Bend, a steep grade in the Sierra Nevada called the Devil's Staircase, a stretch of Nevada desert where the road disappeared into alkali flats. The warnings were often the only protection. The radio did not exist in 1-9-2-0. There were no highway patrols. If a car broke down, the driver had to walk or wait for a passing motorist. If a driver lost control, no ambulance was coming. The road was a wilderness of asphalt and gravel. The Harmon family had no chance after the train hit them. The railroad did not even have a medical kit. The failure of the system was not just about a missing gate. It was about a society that permitted such a road to exist without oversight. The Lincoln Highway was a private enterprise. It was built by people who believed in the power of the automobile to change the world. They were right about the change, but they were wrong about the speed of adaptation. The road was built too fast for the safety systems to keep up. The result was years of bloodshed. The inheritance of that bloodshed is the modern highway system. Interstate highways have grade-separated crossings, guardrails, medians, and emergency call boxes. The safety standards we take for granted today were written in the blood of the first motorists. The Lincoln Highway is the foundation of that system, but the foundation is stained. To drive the Lincoln Highway today is to travel through history, but it is also to travel through a graveyard. Every milepost marks a story that could have ended in tragedy. Most did not, but some did. The Harmon family is just one of many. Their story is not unique, and that is precisely why it matters. It is a reminder that the road we travel today was made possible by the sacrifices of those who traveled before us, often without knowing the risks. And still, the road endures. The markers remain. The stories wait. The question of safety is no longer unanswered, but the road itself still carries the memory of every mistake made along its path. That memory is what the Lincoln Highway Association, in its restoration efforts, is preserving. Not just the concrete and steel, but the memory of what happened there. The good and the bad, the joy and the grief. The lives that were lived and lost on a road that started as a dream and became a reality, one milepost at a time. But the reality was not just a dream of connectivity. It was also a daily confrontation with death. At 2:15 p.m. on the 17th of July 1921, a Ford Model T touring car approached a level crossing on the Lincoln Highway near Blair, Nebraska. The driver was a farmer named Henry Grimes. In the car with him were his wife Martha and their 3 children, ages 6, 4, and 18 months. They were headed to Omaha to visit Martha's sister. The day was hot and clear. The gravel road was dry. The crossing was marked only by a wooden post with a faded sign that read "Look out for trains." There was no gate, no light, no flagman. Henry Grimes slowed the car. He looked both ways. He saw nothing. He pulled the Model T onto the tracks, the engine revved, the wheels bumped over the rails. That is when the train came around a curve a quarter mile to the east. It was a Union Pacific freight locomotive pulling 40 cars. The engineer saw the car on the tracks. He pulled the whistle cord. The blast was loud, but Henry Grimes could not hear it over his own engine. The engineer threw the brakes. The train began to slow, but it was too close. The impact occurred at 2:16 p.m. The Model T was thrown 30 feet off the tracks. The metal body crumpled. The gas tank exploded. All 5 occupants died instantly or within seconds. What happened? The crossing was known to be dangerous. Local residents had complained for years. The Lincoln Highway ran parallel to the railroad for 2 miles before crossing it at this point. The tracks curved just east of the crossing, blocking the view of an approaching train until it was nearly upon the road. The same curve also blocked the engineer's view of the car until the last moment. The railroad had considered installing an automatic gate in 1919, but decided the cost was too high. The crossing was used by fewer than a dozen cars per day. The railroad argued that a gate was not justified by the traffic volume. The Lincoln Highway Association had surveyed the crossing in 1920. Their report noted the poor sight distance and recommended a gate, but the association had no authority to compel any action. The Union Pacific claimed the crossing was the responsibility of the local road authority, which was Dodge County. Dodge County claimed it was a railroad crossing, and therefore the railroad's responsibility. The state of Nebraska had no highway department with enforcement power until 1920. The crossing existed in a legal void. After the Grimes family died, the local coroner's jury returned a verdict of accidental death caused by the failure of the railway company to provide adequate warning. The Union Pacific paid a small settlement to the family's estate. The railroad then installed a gate. It was a simple wooden gate operated by a hand crank, but it was better than nothing. It took 3 deaths to get 1 gate. The Grimes accident was not unusual. Along the entire Lincoln Highway, similar stories repeated week after week. The association's own guidebook for 1921 listed 1,284 railroad crossings between New York and San Francisco. Of those, only 347 had any form of active warning. The rest relied entirely on the driver's eyes and judgment. In the first 6 months of 1921, the association recorded 73 crossing accidents on the route, with 39 fatalities. The true number was almost certainly higher because many accidents went unreported. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the fragmented structure of early 20th century governance. Roads were local, railroads were private. The federal government had no role in highway safety until 1920. The Lincoln Highway Association was a private organization funded by the automobile industry. Its primary goal was to promote the road to sell cars and tires, not to regulate safety. The association's executive secretary, A.G. Batchelder, wrote in 1920 that the safety of the highway is the responsibility of those who use it. That statement was convenient for an organization that did not want to spend money on safety improvements, but the drivers were not equipped to handle the danger. The typical car in 1921 had no seatbelts, no crumple zones, no headlights that could illuminate more than 50 feet. The brakes were mechanical and often failed. The tires were prone to blowouts. The steering was loose. The driver had no training. There were no driver's licenses in most states. The only qualification required was the ability to start the engine. Against this backdrop, every crossing was a gamble. The Grimes family lost the gamble. So did the Harmons in Ohio a year later. So did hundreds of others whose names are not recorded. The aftermath of the Grimes accident brought a brief wave of local outrage. The Blair Enterprise newspaper published an editorial titled "The Cross of the Crossing," demanding that the county and railroad act. The Union Pacific responded by installing a gate, but they did not install gates at other similar crossings along the same line. The county surveyed the crossing and widened the gravel approach to improve visibility. But the fundamental problem remained. The road was being built faster than the safety infrastructure. The Lincoln Highway was laid out across rural America where trains had run for decades. The roads crossed the tracks everywhere. The railroads resisted change because gates cost money and the liability laws favored them. The legal doctrine of the time was that drivers had a duty to look and listen at crossings. If a driver failed to look, the railroad was not liable even if the crossing was dangerous. This rule is known as the last clear chance doctrine. It placed the burden of safety entirely on the driver. The Grimes family looked, but they did not see the train in time because of the curve. The law did not care about the curve. The railroad was absolved. But the Grimes accident and others like it began to change public opinion. In 1922, the National Safety Council formed a committee on railroad crossing safety. In 1923, the American Association of State Highway Officials adopted a standard for crossing warning devices. In 1924, the federal government passed the Railroad Grade Crossing Act, which provided matching funds for the installation of automatic gates. But the funding was voluntary. Many states took years to apply. By the late 1920s, the Lincoln Highway had been largely paved and upgraded. The number of crossing accidents on the route declined, but the decline was not due to any single policy. It was due to a combination of better engineering, more trains with better brakes, and the gradual replacement of rural crossings with grade separations. It was also due to the slow accumulation of public pressure generated by the deaths of people like Henry Grimes. What remains of the Grimes story? The crossing near Blair still exists. The railroad line is still active. The crossing now has automatic gates with flashing lights and bells. The Lincoln Highway has been replaced by US Route 30 and later Interstate 80. The old roadbed is a local road or a gravel path in places. The Grimes family is buried in a small cemetery outside Blair. Their headstone is simple. Henry Grimes 1875-1921, Martha Grimes 1880-1921 are children. There is no mention of the accident. The site of the crossing is unmarked, but the memory of such accidents is embedded in the asphalt. Every time a modern driver approaches a railroad crossing with gates and lights, they are benefiting from a safety system that was paid for in blood. The Lincoln Highway as a physical route is a relic of a time when the cost of progress was measured in lives. The forgotten story of the highway is not that it was built. It is that it was built without any system to protect the people who used it. The system came later, built on the ruins of families like the Grimeses and the Harmons. The Lincoln Highway Association today has over 2,000 members. They restore markers, publish maps, and hold annual tour. They tell the story of the road as a celebration of American ingenuity and adventure. And it is, but the adventure came at a price. The adventure was not fun for the children who died at crossings. The adventure was not a joyride for the mother who watched her husband's head crushed by a train. The adventure was a daily act of survival. To drive the Lincoln Highway now is to travel through a corridor of memory. The road is quiet now, mostly rural, mostly forgotten. But every milepost stands not only as a marker of distance but as a monument to the fallen. The road itself is a kind of graveyard, unmarked and unnamed, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The dead are invisible, but they are present. They are the reason the road is safe today. They are the cost of the lesson. The lesson is simple. A road without safety is not a road. It is a trap. The Lincoln Highway was a trap for the first generation of motorists. They did not know it. They trusted the men who sold them the cars, the tires, the gasoline, and the maps. Those men did not tell them the truth. The truth was that the road was deadly. The truth was that no one was responsible. The truth was that if you died on the Lincoln Highway, your family would get a small settlement and a marker in a cemetery, and the road would continue to kill others. That truth was finally acknowledged in the 193s when the federal government began to take responsibility for highway safety. The Bureau of Public Roads developed standards for intersection design, signage, crosswalks, and guardrails. The states adopted driver licensing. The car manufacturers added safety glass, hydraulic brakes, and seatbelts. The railroads were required to install gates. The death toll began to fall, but it never fell to zero. And the Lincoln Highway is still there, a relic of the era before safety was a priority. The markers remain, placed by the association in the 120s and now restored by volunteers. The markers are concrete with a red, white, and blue shield. They say Lincoln Highway. They do not say use at your own risk. They do not say 12 people died here. They do not say the dream of the highway became the nightmare of the crossing. But we know because the story is still being told. The forgotten story is not really forgotten. It is just buried under the asphalt, waiting for someone to remember the names. Henry Grimes, Martha Grimes, William Harmon, Clara Harmon, their children, their broken cars, their broken bodies, their broken families, all of them part of the cost of a road that connected the country and killed the unwary. The Lincoln Highway is a monument to ambition, but it is also a monument to neglect. The neglect has been corrected, the road is now safe, but the original innocence of the road is gone. The road that was built on hope was also built on death. That is the forgotten story. That is the story we must remember as we drive the modern highways, trusting the gates and lights and signs, never knowing that they exist only because of those who died before them. The final milepost stands near San Francisco at the terminus of the highway. It is a simple obelisk in Lincoln Park. The park overlooks the Golden Gate. The view is beautiful. The road ends, but the story does not end. The story continues in every driver who approaches a railroad crossing and pauses, looks both ways, and listens. That pause is the legacy of the forgotten. The pause is the only tribute the dead can receive. The pause is the moment when the road remembers.